So in psychology, there are four main types of research studies. Now, there are more. There are things like case studies and things, but these are the ones that are most commonly used in modern day psychology. And these fall under the categories of observational, correlational, experimental, and quasi-experimental studies. Now, today I'm going to be talking primarily about quasi-experimental studies. Now, a quasi-experiment, there are two or more groups of an independent variable. So you might be noticing that if you've already watched my experimental research video, this sounds very similar. And the description here is actually, I even copied and pasted and just changed a couple words here. The only difference between an experiment and a quasi-experiment is that there's no random assignment. The experimenter did not manipulate your independent variable and did not randomly assign participants to groups. Now you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't the experimenter randomly assign if they could? Well, usually we only run at quasi-experiments when we can't randomly assign people. So you might ask yourself, why would I not randomly assign people to groups if I have the ability? And usually you always do if you have the ability. Now that's the key difference, right? There are some research studies or research questions that it would be great if we could randomly assign people to groups, but we can't. So take, for example, if I wanted to know if smoking causes lung cancer. Now, the reality is that we know that smoking generally causes lung cancer, but this is actually a lot more difficult of a study to run than it might seem at first glance. Because can I randomly assign someone? When we talked about the experimental study, remember, participants enter your room and enter the study room, and they possess a variety of individual differences, right? There might be some of your participants that are more extroverted than others. There might be some of your participants that are more liberal than others. There might be some of your participants that are more intelligent than others. But they enter the research room possessing these different individual differences, and then in an ideal world, you randomly assign them to the different conditions in your study, which in this case would be smoking or not, right? These are the different conditions in the study, but can I randomly assign my participants to smoke or not? No, that would be highly unethical, especially if we think that smoking might cause lung cancer. And so in this case, we cannot randomly assign. And when you can't randomly assign, you run what is called a quasi-experiment, where it looks to be like an experiment, meaning that you have an independent variable that has groups. So in this case, the groups are smoking versus not smoking. And you still have an outcome variable, which is prevalence of lung cancer or whether they have lung cancer or not. And you still even run the same statistical test, right? In this case, we would run a t-test or a chi-square test. If it's a categorical dependent variable, you'll learn potentially more about these statistical tests, especially if you're in an introductory unit when you're watching this video. But we've got two different groups predicting some outcome variable. And in this case, because I didn't randomly assign them, you might be asking yourself, well, what are the limitations of a quasi-experiment? We already know that sort of experimental designs are the best, right? These are the ones that allow us to assume causality, meaning they allow us to say that one thing causes another. Well, the issue with a quasi-experimental study is right here, that if we do not randomly assign our participants to groups, they're probably having a lot of individual differences that might account for changes in your outcome despite it being, predicted by your independent variable. So take, for example, people who smoke. There's been research showing that people who smoke generally have higher levels of impulsivity. Well, people with higher levels of impulsivity are also more likely to do a variety of different activities and behaviors that might also lead to a higher prevalence of developing lung cancer. And as a result, people might develop lung cancer not because they smoked, but because of these other impulsive type behaviors that they are engaging in. And so again, the issue with a quasi-experiment is right here, that by not randomly assigning people to groups, we don't wash out the individual differences. And it might be the case that people in the smoking group just might happen to have another characteristic like impulsivity that might lead to a higher prevalence of smoking. There might be socioeconomic status differences. There might be other group-based differences here that are actually causing a higher prevalence of lung cancer that is not the act of smoking. Now, that being said, do cigarettes and does smoking cause lung cancer? The reality is yes. We have run and we found ways using modern technology to see what the effects are of smoking on the lungs through simulations and things like this. Researchers have been able to more experimentally test this. But there are a number of situations, like I cannot randomly assign people to be a Butler University student versus a Purdue University student. I can't do that. They are already a student at one of these two colleges. I cannot randomly assign them to those groups. I can't randomly assign people to their gender, to their race, to their eye color, or other characteristics. These are still important characteristics to study, though. And it's important to still study them. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't run quasi-experiments. Quasi-experiments are very valuable research studies. They just can't meet every criteria for causality, and they especially fall short on the internal validity. So quasi-experiments especially fall short on the internal validity criteria of causation because they don't have the ability to rule out those third variables or those confounds because we do not have random assignment.